Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm your host, Joshua Phillip.
And I'm Tiffany Meyer.
We begin in East Palestine, Ohio with the train derailment and chemical spill, which is turning into an even bigger disaster, not just for the environment, but for, well, everyone involved.
And while it's been over a week since the train derailed on February 3rd, the ensuing fallout from the toxic smoke is still being felt. Local residents are torn between differing statements.
Well, the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, initially telling residents the black clouds from the burning of hazardous materials pose no threat. But reports from locals showed pets coughing and dying, and it's raising deeper concerns of whether there really is a threat to humans.
And now, as the shock from the initial environmental disaster clears, focus is beginning to shift towards its cause. Ohio Governor Mike DeWine saying yesterday that the cargo on the train had not been defined as high hazardous material. Security camera footage now being made public shows that the train may have been on fire for 20 miles before it finally derailed and burst into flames. The issue is still being investigated, but video suggests it may have been caused by a problem on one of the train's axles.
And focus is also shifting towards warnings that have been previously made, raised by rail workers, that they were understaffed, overworked, and highly stressed. Now, this was about bringing risks of a disaster. Because of this, the rail unions were threatening to hold a strike. And just prior to the very real disaster now taking place in East Palestine, Ohio, Congress voted to block the strike. And President Biden signed a bill in December of 2022. Time reported that Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi successfully rallied rank-and-file Democrats to side with rail executives over their workers. And in doing this, it states, Biden signed into law a measure that made a rail strike illegal.
It's still to be seen what the full impact of the chemical spill is and where the blame will fall. But as it unfolds, the environmental disaster could very easily turn into a political disaster. Earlier today, I spoke with Epoch Times reporter Jeff Louderback. He's on the ground in East Palestine. Jeff Louderback, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So you've been covering this story and you've actually traveled to East Palestine to find out what's really happening there. So what have you heard from locals?
Well, I've been here since about a day and a half, and February 3rd was the date of the derailment. It was a derailment, a chemical spill, and a controlled burn. So they were concerned about an explosion happening. Since then, they've determined there's 4 toxic chemicals that have been released. Locals they lifted the evacuation ban or notice 5 days in, so it's February 8th. Locals are concerned that it's too quick because they don't know what's happening in the soil. They don't know the long-term health effects of the soil, the water. I talked to a woman who has a homestead. She has 30 acres, but mostly 3 acres that she has goats, chickens, a large garden. She doesn't know if she's going to be able to eat the eggs or the meat chickens or the goat's milk, or whether she's able to grow vegetables, whether she can eat that, because they haven't been able to test anything. And that's the frustration, a lack of transparency and a lack of response.
Oh, wow. And so to your point, the EPA and the Norfolk Southern Railway are claiming they are monitoring the situation, that the air quality is okay, and that people can return. But from your reporting, as you mentioned, locals seem pretty hesitant to trust those assurances. Why is that?
Well, they just haven't got any clear answers. Tonight, I'm going to be covering, there's a town hall tonight at East Palestine High School. I guess the EPA, the state of Ohio, Norfolk Southern, local government supposed to be there. So they hope for answers there, and they just want to know how they can get assistance and how what the plan is to test food, to test air quality for the long term. Because it's not necessarily right, or not just right now, it's what's going to happen 5 months down the road, 5 years down the road.
And speaking of the chemicals, it seems a hazardous materials specialist, Sil Cagiano, who lives near East Palestine, said in an interview that the chemical spill is equivalent to nuking a town. And those are very strong words. So what are the questions regarding these chemicals' health impacts? Is the EPA or the railway addressing the potential long-term impacts, or is there a general sense that it's being maybe swept under the rug?
Well, that's the residents are skeptical that they're not being told accurate information. Really, the EPA, the state of Ohio, they have been very vague with responses. Governor Mike DeWine, the Ohio governor, because we're on the Ohio-Pennsylvania border, Governor DeWine gave a press conference yesterday saying if he lived here, he would drink bottled water. I thought that was pretty telling. And but they've been pretty vague. They haven't come out and said anything about long-term effects, because I really don't think they know. Really, it's just an unknown right now what the long-term effects will be. But people are uneasy because they don't know if they could eat, drink, grow vegetables. It's all uncertain right now.
And Jeff, touching on what you spoke about earlier, we are also hearing reports of livestock dying and dead fish in the water. The Ohio Department of Natural Resources said the chemical spill killed an estimated 3,500 fish across 7.5 miles of streams. Have you in your reporting witnessed anything like that while being in East Palestine?
I haven't seen any dead livestock or dead fish, but I've been provided photos, and I'm actually here in between our interview here and the town hall tonight at 7. I'm going out to a stream where I've been told there's dead fish just to see if that's there. But we're not talking about just East Palestine. Those reports are also 20, 30-mile radius. And then over the next week, I'm going to be following the Ohio River all the way down to Cincinnati, which is about 250, 275 miles from here. And there's already reports that water quality all the way down to Cincinnati has been affected.
Wow. And Jeff, lastly, what's the most significant concern following this train derailment in Ohio?
Well, obviously the health people don't know if they're really worried that they're not going to, like 5 years from now, there'll be liver cancer or some type of health issue because of what's going on right now. And equally, they're concerned about their homes, whether they could stay. You know, this is home to a lot of people because it's a small town. It's everyone knows everyone. People are very loyal. They love it here. Simple lifestyle. It's Appalachia. But many of these people don't have the means to pick up and leave. So that's the concern, if they have to leave, and the fact that they can't afford to leave.
Wow. Well, Jeff Louderback, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And coming up after the break, we're joined by environmental attorney Steve Malloy, who's here to disclose the environmental disaster unfolding in Ohio. You don't want to miss it.
Everything that's reported on television isn't always true, but it should be. NTD, the power of truth. Now available 24/7 on television and streaming platforms.
NTD's Capital Report. It's about getting answers, cutting through the fog of politics. It's about your questions and our chances to ask.
What is the net impact of the American Congressman Graves? Thank you for joining us.
We're speaking to those in power to find out what does this mean for the people. We're here so you're in the know.
Navigating a world of economic madness, you need to have the right guide. What do today's decisions mean for your tomorrow? We ask why. What's the alternative? Uncover the deeper reasons and the hidden influences, and highlight the real opportunities for profit. At Entity Business, we connect the dots for you. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. Entity Business. I'm Paul Green.
At The Nation Speaks, we don't just scratch the surface. We want to go wide and deep. Our viewers come away with a much richer understanding of the issues of the day. We really make a big effort to bring on different voices onto the show. We don't just talk to experts and newsmakers, which of course are extremely important, but we also want to hear from the American people. So the people who are impacted by the policies and issues that we're talking about, because what they have to say is just as important to the national conversation.
Welcome back. It's been over a week since a train carrying toxic chemicals like vinyl chloride derailed in Ohio, and the government decided to light them on fire. And now the EPA is claiming that everything is kosher and it's safe for people to return to their homes. But some are finding that hard to believe.
Now, joining us to discuss this unfolding environmental disaster is environmental attorney Steve Malloy. Steve is the founder and publisher of Junk Science and also served on the EPA transition team for the Trump administration. Hey, Steve, thanks for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Now, vinyl chloride, it's a known carcinogen, of course, meaning it causes cancer. They lit it on fire. I mean, how bad is it? How bad is this? What does it actually mean for people?
Well, it's hard to tell because, we have the problem of EPA saying it's safe, but we also don't know what the exposure levels are. And this is a problem because you may recall with the first responders at 9/11, EPA said the air was safe, but it wasn't. With the burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan, the government said it was safe, but it wasn't. EPA was caught lying about the Flint water crisis, the spill of the Gold King mine during the Obama administration. So EPA, and I've worked on EPA issues for almost 33 years, and EPA does not have a strong track record of telling the truth. And here we have EPA just coming out and saying, oh, everything is fine, 2 days after, several days after, they set up a whole tanker car of vinyl chloride on fire with, black smoke. Everyone saw that. For the last 50 years, EPA has been telling everyone that any exposure to vinyl chloride can cause cancer. Now, I know that that's not exactly true. The EPA is exaggerating, but that is EPA's position. And so here we have a whole, 1 million gallons of vinyl chloride going up in smoke, and EPA is saying shortly after that it's safe to go back. And you can't have it both ways. And the fact that EPA is not disclosing to the public the measurements in the air, the water, and the soil, and in the homes makes you very suspicious. I mean, normally I like to come and in the media and ease people's fears about their exposure to toxic chemicals, but I can't do it in this case because I don't know what the exposures were.
And Steve, to your point on the EPA's sketchy track record there, the EPA is now telling locals everything is safe, right? The air is safe to breathe, they can return home. But locals are reporting, say, issues with their pets, even seeing them die. So what's really happening here? What's going on?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's a horror show. It's a clown show. Yesterday, the state of Ohio rolls out this guy who says, oh, well, the VOC's in the air, it's just like pumping gas. Well, I'm sorry, pumping gas is not like 1 million gallons of vinyl chloride that went up in black clouds of smoke. That's just not true. EPA has been very cavalier about this whole thing. The EPA administrator didn't say anything about this whole catastrophe till yesterday. He didn't start tweeting about it until yesterday. There was nothing on the EPA's website until yesterday, 10 days after the catastrophe. In the meantime, the EPA Administrator Michael Reagan has been jetting around the country, going to North Carolina, Kansas to talk about electric vehicles, buses, environmental justice, climate, all this nonsense. Meanwhile, he's got a genuine environmental catastrophe on his hands, and he is the EPA Administrator, and he's not there. He should be on scene, as well as Secretary of Transportation Buttigieg. He should be there as well. But no one is. Where's FEMA? They're not there. We have no explanation. I mean, our government is incompetent. They're not giving anyone the answers they need. There are people who are concerned, have genuine concerns. They smell things. They don't know whether it's safe. They're smart enough to know not to trust the government. But, it shouldn't be that way. We pay Michael Reagan and EPA to be there for exactly this, environmental catastrophes. Instead, they're off on their political agenda, climate, electric vehicles, what have you. This is just a gross failure of the Biden administration.
Well, I'm curious. You said that the EPA had lied on previous issues in the past. You talked about the burn pits in Afghanistan. You talked about 9/11 and the air problems with that. Is it accurate to say that they're actually lying in those cases? And based on your understanding of how the organization works, how much does politics play a role when it comes to telling people about health issues like this?
Well, I know people at the time, if EPA said it was safe and it wasn't. We are compensating first responders now. We are compensating the troops that were exposed to burn pits because, in fact, the air wasn't safe. How much of this was politics? Well, it's all politics with EPA. That's kind of the problem. That's why there's no one there. That's why they're out promoting the climate agenda and electric vehicles and the Inflation Reduction Act spending. And they're not there because they weren't picked for these jobs because they know how to respond. Michael Reagan is, the EPA administrator, was a lawyer for the Environmental Defense Fund. Okay, he's not an expert in cleaning up toxic messes. He doesn't know anything about it. And the EPA staff is just chock full of these people. They're happy to, regulate you to death, but when it comes to an emergency like this, they're just not very good. They're not prepared. This is not what we pay them for. This is a disaster.
And Steve, lastly, what do you think are the long-term health effects of this train derailment?
Well, so I would like to know what the exposures were. See, this is the problem. EPA is coming out saying it's safe. I need numbers. Yeah, I need to know what people were exposed to. That's the only way we can say it's safe or not. In what I normally do, I like to put people's minds at ease. Say the exposures were too low. It's the dose that makes the poison. But I can't do that here. This is like the first time in 30 years I can't do that because EPA is withholding the numbers. And at this point, I don't even trust EPA with the numbers. I don't know what we're going to do. This is not a good situation.
Well, Steve, thanks so much for joining us and sharing your insights.
Thank you.
Coming up after the break, we're joined by Rick Fisher, who's here to give us an analysis on the Chinese spy balloon and the other mysterious objects that have been entering U.S. airspace. Apparently, the southern border isn't the only area of the United States seeing a significant increase in illegal crossings. Now, we know that the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, sent at least one balloon into U.S. airspace, but now 3 mystery objects could also be Chinese.
So is China increasing its spying on the United States? And if yes, why? Joining us to discuss this is Senior Fellow at the International Assessment and Strategy Center, Rick Fisher. Rick, thank you so much for joining us. Great to see you.
Great to see you, Tiffany and Josh.
So we know that at least one of the objects that entered U.S. airspace was a balloon from China. And while the CCP claims it was a weather balloon, the Pentagon has said that's 100% not true. What's really going on here?
Well, Tiffany, in the last 24 hours, U.S. intelligence officials have revealed that the balloon was launched from Hainan Island. Hainan Island is where China keeps most of its nuclear missile-armed, nuclear-powered submarines, its SSBNs. These are now armed, according to a U.S. Navy revelation about 5 months ago, with the new JL-3 submarine-launched ballistic missile. U.S. intelligence officials also revealed that the balloon was aimed at Guam, but was mistakenly blown off course when it was gathered up by drafts and strong winds. Well, this is not believable at all, not credible. If the People's Liberation Army thought their surveillance balloon was being mistakenly directed, they could have prompted it to be destroyed, but they didn't. They were quite pleased that the balloon would be carried over the United States, that it would allow the PLA to observe several American nuclear weapon bases and provide what's really key here is intimate weather data over these nuclear bases. In order for nuclear warheads, or more importantly, new hypersonic glide vehicle nuclear warheads to hit their targets, the PLA requires intimate weather data. A balloon inside the atmosphere can provide that data much better.
Now, Rick, we saw some video footage of the Chinese Communist Party testing different weapon launch platforms using balloons like this, including for the hypersonic glide missiles. Do you see that as a realistic threat from the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, the balloon carrying a weapon, that balloon, not that balloon, because it can't go high enough for an electromagnetic pulse weapon to really be effective. And the use of the balloons to launch hypersonic glide vehicles was part of an aerodynamic test. They wouldn't be dropping those on American targets. But the balloon itself is a surveillance platform, imagery, and more importantly, weather data, so that the correct trajectory can be put on those warheads and hypersonic glide vehicles.
And Rick, you've been speaking about China's military buildup specifically in space. How should we read Biden's messaging on this balloon, and how do you think China will?
Well, the administration's delay for several days in shooting down this balloon sends a message of confusion and chaos. How will Biden react when China actually attacks Taiwan, slaughtering tens or hundreds of thousands of people? And why isn't the administration explaining plainly that the balloon was launched from one of the most important PLA nuclear weapons complexes? It is equipped to help target Chinese nuclear warheads, and its traversing the United States represents a Chinese exercise in nuclear coercion and intimidation.
Well, that's pretty serious. Rick, do you think it's accurate to say that this does represent then a nuclear threat from China?
It is part of the complex of systems, Josh, that allow China to accurately target its nuclear weapons. It can't be overstated that estimating the weather, the density of the atmosphere, the direction of the winds, whether there's rain or snow over a target, is crucial to the targeting of these weapons. A balloon inside the atmosphere will always obtain better data, weather data, than satellites in space. And this balloon is controlled by the Strategic Support Force, most likely. The Strategic Support Force also controls the satellites and is intimately involved in the targeting of Chinese nuclear weapons.
And Rick, there have been 3 other objects that crossed into U.S. airspace, and we're not really being given clear answers for any of them. What do you think they are?
It's hard to say at this point, Tiffany, absent leaks from the government or actual press conferences talking about them. They are of varied shapes, sizes, much smaller than the Chinese balloon. Are they also attempts by China to gather intelligence, or are these balloons launched simply by citizens on a lark? I mean, we see these kinds of balloons flying over used car lots most frequently. They're easy to buy. The Chinese make them. You can buy them by the boatload from Alibaba. It's just hard to say at this point.
Now, if you were to tell people what the significance is of all this, in terms of the timing, there was going to be a pretty high-level diplomatic meeting in China. Why now? Why do you think the CCP is doing this right now?
Josh, right now, because this is the year that Xi Jinping wants to make clear to the United States that their support for Taiwan, for freedom on Taiwan, could lead to war, even nuclear war. And the balloon is really the first of what's going to become a constant pattern in our lives of aircraft carriers sailing off our coasts, bombers flying off our coasts. PLA, nuclear and military intimidation, is only going to grow and become regular in our lives from this point. The balloon marks a beginning of the Chinese desire to make Americans afraid.
Wow. Well, Rick, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, coming up after the break, we're going to be joined by retired Air Force Brigadier General Robert Spalding. He'll give us a breakdown on whether the rules have changed when it comes to dealing with adversarial powers like China.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us.
There's reporting that can be trusted. There are programs that can inspire every generation. There is a television network worth watching and sharing. Our commitment is to bring you the facts and to show you the world. We won't be divided by politics, and we won't be swayed by the dollar. We believe in the strength of our nation and the hope in our shared humanity. We are NTD Television, and we are proud to bring you news you can trust and programs that make you smile. NTD Television, now available 24/7 on television and streaming platforms.
It's just clear as day. The media, whether it's broadcast, cable, or print media, has become extremely biased. And I started looking online for alternative ways to get information. And I saw an ad for a free trial. And I looked at it and I said, Epoch Times. I mean, come on, this is end of days type of stuff. I mean, what are they going to be talking about here? And I said, well, it's a free trial. Let me dig in. Is it giving me both sides? Is it giving me an objective point of view here? I have looked for opportunities to see where they might be biased, and I don't find it. It has given me a level of trust in media that I didn't think I'd ever get back. I love the Epoch Times because it has renewed my faith in the idea that a reliable, responsible, non-biased source of information is available. And I can say that I love it because of that.
Welcome back. Has the U.S. moved into a more aggressive military stance? The recent shoot-downs of a Chinese spy balloon and 3 mystery objects are raising the question, have the rules of engagement changed?
This comes as the U.S. military's readiness for war is coming under scrutiny, and experts are noting weaknesses in America's defense abilities from the apparent inability to detect the objects until they entered U.S. airspace, to fail to track objects near sensitive nuclear silos as well.
Joining us now to help shed light on the bigger picture is retired U.S. Air Force Brigadier General Robert Spalding. He's also a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, contributor with the Epoch Times, and author of Stealth War. General, thank you so much for joining us. Great to see you again.
Thank you. Great to be here.
General, there's been a lot of buzz around what the spy balloon signifies. In terms of U.S.-China relations, have those changed?
Well, I think what people fail to acknowledge is something that the Chinese Communist Party has known for several decades, and that is the Cold War really never ended. And it's essentially, a lot of people would say we're in Cold War number 2, but from the position of the Chinese Communist Party, you can say that they just really never let go of the fact that they believe that communism, that their method of government, and this is what Xi says all the time, is much better for the world than democracy. And I think what you've seen is them demonstrating that China's on the rise and their brand of communism works. And many of the emerging market countries look to China now instead of the United States. And primarily it's because the United States have given up leadership to the world by allowing China to rise in power and helping that rise.
You know, General, one thing I've been paying attention to is it looks like we're watching a real serious, let's say, kind of breaching of the normal ways we would deal with a situation like this. We see an escalation in our response. We're actually shooting down objects now. How significant is it that they shoot down this balloon and then they start shooting down other objects? What does this tell us?
Well, I mean, one of the things it tells us is that as long as the Cold War was for over 4 decades, we had never, the North American Air Defense Treaty had never resulted in a shoot down by an American aircraft over our homeland. So one of the things it demonstrates is our homeland now is at risk. It's at risk not just from espionage, from Chinese nationals who come here and basically work on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party, but now also these balloons. And I think the other thing that we found out, once they flew this giant balloon overhead and we realized that we couldn't see it, you could see it with your eyes, but our radars couldn't see it. Then they began to turn off the settings that said, hey, we're going to discount anything that's really slow like a balloon because we don't think of it as a threat. So what other things have we been missing all of this time, and for how long have these objects, maybe smaller in nature than the giant balloon that just flew overhead, how many have been flying over and collecting information about our sensitive sites? And the answer is we don't know.
In general, on your point, the Senate Intelligence Chair, Senator Mark Warner, has been saying that some damage was done by letting the Chinese spy balloon float across the country, but he's also saying that's not in terms of data that might have been collected. So what was the damage here?
Well, the damage is really to our national standing. I think what it does is it sends a message to the world that the United States can't even defend its own airspace from this balloon floating over. And it really, puts us on our back foot a little bit with our allies and partners. If we can't defend our own airspace, how can we help defend theirs? And I think that's the piece that, Washington, D.C. has missed in this case. It's not just about the spying. It's about the message it sends to not only our allies and partners, but those who would be, who are the allies and partners of the Chinese Communist Party.
You mentioned the significance of what looks like a change in the rules of engagement and something that does seem to be unprecedented. Does this in any way signify we may be entering kind of the hot war phase with China?
Well, I mean, in a sense, you could say we entered the hot war phase of the second Cold War when Russia invaded Ukraine. It's kind of like when North Korea invaded South Korea. That wasn't the only thing that happened during the Cold War. You know, the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia, for example. We had the Vietnam War. There was a lot of other proxy wars that occurred, you know. So what's the goal? The goal is we don't want to have a nuclear war with China or Russia. We don't want the Cold War to become a hot war in the sense that we don't want to be slinging nuclear weapons at each other. But that doesn't mean that Russia is not going to continue to invade its neighbors. It's already threatened to invade Poland. It also doesn't mean that China is not going to invade Taiwan or other neighbors. It's already shown that it can invade, you know, for example, it's gone across the border against India. Anywhere along its border, China is a threat to its neighbor. I think the most serious threat that we have to reckon with here, you know, right now is Taiwan.
In general, what can you tell us about the bigger picture behind the Chinese spy balloon, from surveillance to the messaging that you were talking about, and even Taiwan?
Well, I think it means that we need to pay much more attention to the homeland in terms of how we protect ourselves, not just from surveillance, but, you know, say that balloon had something like an EMP weapon that could take down our communications or our electrical grid. We haven't hardened our infrastructure against those kinds of threats. So it's not only, you know, we need to protect ourselves against TikTok or the, you know, 50-cent army that China has of influencers on Twitter or Facebook, or, you know, the damage to our financial system or our supply chain. It's across the board. It's the homeland. And then also we have to start to look at our relationships with our allies and partners. How do we protect them? Because they can end up being an avenue for a threat from China. We have to look differently at the world. We're now in a bipolar world where China is leading the coalition of nations that threaten the free world. And we have to be the leader of the free world. We have to protect ourselves. We have to strengthen ourselves. But then we have to work with our allies and partners to ensure the promotion of the liberal democratic order going forward, or else it's all going to be lost.
General, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And coming up after the break, we're joined by Dr. Peter McCullough. He's here to discuss the CDC's new medical diagnosis codes, including one for the unvaccinated, which has some medical experts concerned about privacy. Find out more after the break.
Welcome back. It's been almost 2 years since Victoria White was charged with alleged crimes at the U.S. Capitol and due to her participation in the January 6th Capitol breach. As part of her condition for release, she agreed to stay away from Washington, D.C. except for court or for meetings with attorneys or Pretrial Services Agency or PSA.
Last week, Victoria met with GOP lawmakers on Capitol Hill to discuss her case and the deaths of 4 Trump supporters on January 6th. The PSA reported this visit as a violation of her pretrial release terms. Federal prosecutors then asked a U.S. district judge to imprison her.
The judge ultimately did not jail her, but gave her a warning and also barred her from appearing at the U.S. Capitol or the congressional office buildings unless she gets permission from the PSA. Victoria joins us now to tell us more about what's happening. Hey, Victoria, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Now, tell us about why you returned to D.C. and basically what happened when you were there.
I returned to D.C. for a plea hearing, which I decided to actually decline, and met with representatives before my hearing.
And while you were there and you met with these representatives, what did you and the group you were with discuss?
We discussed, we asked for an investigation into the 4 deaths of the January 6ers who were murdered on January 6th, as well as the unconstitutional and just long detainment, pretrial detainment of January 6th men who've been locked up over 2 years, and the treatment that they're receiving, as well as the weaponization of the government against us, and asked for all that to be looked into.
Victoria, of course, we included in our documentary, The Real Story of January 6th. You were, of course, beaten in the tunnel entrance to the Capitol building. We have it on video, in fact. We also know that at that tunnel entrance, Roseanne Boyland was killed. And, we're still trying to figure out exactly what happened with that. What are some of your concerns in terms of the use of force tactics after seeing some of the footage?
Of course, the use of force continuum was not followed, and for whatever reason, DC Metropolitan Police and the Capitol Police get a pass. If this would have been my state, Minnesota, there would have been an uproar, so I would assume. But for some reason, these men are not only getting a pass, the man who beat me was promoted twice. Lieutenant Byrd, who shot and killed Ashley Babbitt, has been called a hero by people on the left, and I'm afraid that what happened in DC is going to become widespread.
And Victoria, going back to when you met with these GOP lawmakers recently, did any of them say anything specific about the House investigations into the long pretrial detentions?
Unfortunately, they didn't. Lauren Bobart did take a lot of notes, and she gave us the longest time. She sat down with us for over 30 minutes, and that really meant a lot to us. But we're just hoping now for other representatives and Congress members to step up and get involved and take action.
You mentioned the weaponization of government, and I know the Republicans in the House are looking into this right now, wondering whether different branches of the U.S. government have basically been weaponized politically. Given what you and others went through on January 6th and, of course, afterwards, I mean, would you argue that you're witnessing a weaponization of the government? What have you personally seen with this?
Yes, I would have to wholeheartedly say that we're seeing and living and experiencing the weaponization of the government, as well as their influence on mainstream media and how they can take political opponents and really not just weaponize the government, but the other citizens as well to think that we're something that we're not.
And you mentioned earlier how maybe not as much is being taken or done by the lawmakers. What would you like to see happen?
Definitely, for starters, the 14,000 hours of video footage released, all of it unedited, just released to the public. I know the speaker was saying that he would like to do that, but it's been over 2 years, and we're ready to see more than just hear words, but to see action. So I think that's a good start.
What would you say is next for your case? I know that you've kind of avoided some of the initial plea deals. What are you hoping for?
For it to go to trial and for the truth of what happened to me to come out, because what happened to me didn't just happen to me, it happened to others there. Obviously, Roseanne Boyland was murdered just feet away from where I was in the tunnel after they had beat me and had taken me in. So I believe that my case will shed light onto the truth of what, just part of the truth of what really happened that day.
Well, Victoria, thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And up next, after the break, we're joined by Dr. Peter McCullough. He's here to discuss the CDC's new medical diagnosis codes, including one for the unvaccinated, which has some medical experts concerned about privacy. Find out more after the break.
The lasting beauty of realistic oil painting. Brilliant, expressive, and inspirational. The 6th NTD International Figure Painting Competition. Guided by pure authenticity, beauty, and goodness. Invites you to join us on a journey back to traditional art. The Gold Award is $10,000. For more details, please visit oilpainting.ntdtv.com.
Freedom is not free, and neither is the truth. In order to bring you the facts, our reporters are out there on the front lines getting the true story. Some of them served 10 years of prison in China. We've been censored on social media. Our Hong Kong printing offices were set on fire, and we've been repeatedly attacked by the Chinese Communist Party. But no matter what, we believe that you deserve the truth, and so we'll continue to bring the truth to light. Head on over to getepic.com and try honest journalism that is based in truth and tradition. We'd love to have you on board.
NTD's Capital Report. It's about getting answers, cutting through the fog of politics. It's about your questions and our chances to ask.
What is the net impact of the American? Congressman Graves, thank you for joining us.
We're speaking to those in power to find out what does this mean for the people. We're here so you are in the know.
Welcome back. The CDC wants to know more about you, specifically if you've had all of the COVID shots or not. So it's implementing new medical diagnosis codes to achieve that goal.
Now, if you visit your healthcare provider because you have the sniffles, the CDC gets a more intimate look at your personal choices on vaccines. At best, it seems unnecessary, but some experts have greater concerns about the new codes. Joining us to discuss this is leading COVID-19 expert and author of the book, Courage to Face COVID-19, Dr. Peter McCullough. Hey, doctor, thank you for being here to join us.
Thanks for having me.
Could you please walk us through these new diagnosis codes? I mean, what are these really about? How do they work?
You know, ICD diagnostic codes are codes that hospitals and doctors, their information is codified into these codes. From my perspective, the single greatest need to know whether or not someone's taken a vaccine and when they took it is when they have a serious medical problem, like a cardiac arrest or a blood clot. The CDC knows who's taken the vaccines. They have the vaccine administration record. So doctors and hospitals need confidential access to the CDC documentation of the vaccines in the setting of cardiovascular, thromboembolic, neurologic emergencies. This is very important. If we have a patient who's comatose after a cardiac arrest, we have to know if they took a vaccine, because the vaccines cause heart damage that precipitate a cardiac arrest. We must know that. That recently occurred with a Buffalo Bills player, Damar Hamlin, and it was vital that the doctor knew his vaccine status. However, the general public has a right to confidentiality of their medical records, and under no circumstances should a health system begin to pry into someone's COVID-19 vaccine history, because the vaccines are so short-lived that even if one took a vaccine or several vaccines, they quickly become out of date.
And doctor, during the height of the pandemic, we saw people were turned away from needed medical procedures like organ transplants because they weren't vaccinated. Now, some are concerned that these new codes could be possible to essentially set up a two-tiered medical system where those who aren't vaccinated don't receive the same level of treatment as those who are vaccinated. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's exactly the reason why people need confidentiality of their vaccine records, and only in the setting of emergency should doctors be able to directly access the CDC records. Cardiac transplantation, other forms of organ transplantation, the published studies show the vaccine actually worsens transplant outcomes. It causes inflammation and causes organ injury. So under no circumstances should a transplant patient ever receive a vaccine. They don't work anyway. They don't stop the infection, don't reduce transmission, and don't reduce severity. So we have situations like that where someone's vaccine status is irrelevant. Transplantation, pregnancy and maternal fetal outcomes, heart catheterization, pacemaker implantation, elective surgeries. The vaccine status is irrelevant, but it's very important in the setting of a complication like a cardiac arrest, blood clot, or intracranial hemorrhage.
Well, that raises some big questions then. If we know all this information, why at this point does it matter if the CDC knows whether we're vaccinated? Why would they have this interest at this time?
Well, the CDC knows. They hold the vaccine administration record. So the CDC actually knows each and every American and who took the vaccine and when. So they don't need any further information from the healthcare systems. I'm making the case, certainly as a cardiologist, I need to know someone's vaccine status when they're presenting to a hospital after a cardiac arrest. I need to know it in the setting of a fatal pulmonary embolism. All the coroners and all the medical examiners, they need to know the vaccine status as they're assigning cause of death. So this is very important. You know, I'm broadcasting from Australia right now, Sydney, Australia, and the same issues are confronting the Australians. And there will be a big push for doctors to be able to access the vaccine administration records in the setting of emergency, because the vaccines are causing serious medical complications.
And doctor, what is your biggest concern regarding these new medical diagnosis codes?
The great concern is that they'll become a disorganized mess because it's time limited. Remember, each shot only lasts theoretically 6 months. So someone who took a shot 18 months ago could be classified as vaccinated by use of these ICD codes on the provider end, just as someone who took one a month ago. So it would be irrelevant from a vaccine efficacy perspective, but would be important from a safety perspective. The CDC has all the records. The CDC should be the source of truth, not hospital systems or patients trying to use vaccine cards.
And Dr. McCullough, I guess just 20 seconds, what do you recommend for people with this?
You know, at this point in time, as a doctor, I don't plan to use the code. I certainly don't plan to use the code unvaccinated. I think that would be a designation that patients wouldn't necessarily want. But I would press hard in the setting of emergency, such as a cardiac arrest, to know from the CDC directly what vaccines and when, because the patient or the family may not be able to tell us.
Hey, Dr. McCullough, thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, folks, that's all from us here tonight on Newsmakers. Be sure to tune in next week, Wednesday, for a brand new episode.
Until then, we wish you all a wonderful rest of your evening. Good night, everyone.